For those of you who are new to Wild Ones, we are a membership organization devoted to promoting the use of native plants to create sustainable landscapes. We carry out our mission through educational programs and provide resources such as the Wild Ones Journal, native garden designs, Seeds for Education grants, and other educational webinars. At the local level, Wild Ones chapters deliver area programs, including garden tours, speakers, conferences, and seed exchanges. If you are not a Wild Ones member, we hope you join us and take advantage of the camaraderie and support that come with being a part of a local chapter. Our critical mission needs you. Wild Ones chapters are where members put mission into action. We get our hands dirty and learn by doing. Chapters are actively recruiting officers and volunteers to plan upcoming events. Chapter activities require the time and talents of many different people to coordinate. Amplify the impact you have on the native plant movement by sharing your skills and enthusiasm with others. Please reach out to your local chapter to find out how you can get involved. If there isn't a chapter near you, now's the time to consider starting a Wild One seedling chapter. Chapter founders across the country connect and collaborate with one another for mutual support and guidance. If you are eager to advance the mission and cultivate support for native plants in your area, visit the Start a Chapter page on the Wild Ones website. Wild Ones inspires people and communities across the country to transform home landscapes into vibrant and essential habitats for all forms of life. Programs like this would not be possible without generous support from our members, donors, and folks like you attending Wild Ones programs. Please consider donating to Wild Ones today by visiting donate.wildones.org.
Thank you for joining us for the Wild Ones Native Garden Design Series. My name is Neil Diboll, President of Prairie Nursery, and I will be your host for this discussion. I'm a Wild Ones Lifetime Honorary Director and a member of the Wild Ones Central Wisconsin chapter. I am honored to be talking today with Scott Calhoun, the designer of Wild Ones Tucson Native Garden Design. Wild Ones Native Garden Designs follow the premise that native plant landscaping can be beautiful, beneficial, and achievable for gardeners of all skill sets and in terms of scope and budget. This program contains resources that include information on how to get started by identifying your ecoregion, selecting and determining plant placement in your yard, considering your own specific climate conditions, and finding local native plant nurseries in your area. The program also features a growing number of free downloadable native garden designs created by professional landscape designers representing various ecoregions in the United States. A plant list accompanies each design and provides a quick preview of the diversity and beauty of the native plants incorporated in the designs, as well as a phased installation approach, all of which can be downloaded and printed easily at home. All designs are assembled using native plants that provide habitat and food for wildlife that offer a colorful and beautiful garden throughout the growing season. We hope these resources inspire, encourage, and motivate you on your native garden journey. We are honored to have designer Scott Calhoun, owner of Zona Gardens in Tucson, Arizona, with us today to share creative insights on his approach to preparing the site, selecting plants, and designing home landscapes in Tucson. Scott Calhoun is a plantsman, designer, and writer based in Tucson, Arizona. He is the author of 6 books about plants, design, and food. His first book, Yard Full of Sun, was awarded the 2006 American Horticulture Society Book Award, and his second title, Chasing Wildflowers, won the Garden Writers Association 2008 Silver Book Award. He is a Phoenix Home and Garden Master of the Southwest, and his most recent book is The Gardener's Guide to Cactus. Scott has designed over 600 residential desert landscapes. Please welcome Scott Calhoun.
Hello. Great to be here, Neil. Thank you.
Great to see you, Scott. Scott, for those of us who are less familiar with the Tucson area, would you please share about the typical weather and climate conditions, including the seasons, temperatures, and weather patterns and experience in this area?
I'd be happy to, Neil. So there's a myth that we have two seasons here, that we have blistering hot and then not quite as hot. That we actually have five distinct seasons. So we have an extra season here. And this season is what we call the dry foresummer. It's the months of May and June. And it's typically a very dry period and a period where we don't have any rainfall. So it's between spring rains and the beginning of the summer monsoon. So it's ultra low humidity, and typically at least a good chunk of that time may have daytime highs that are over 100 degrees. So that's the fifth season. Because we're relatively high in elevation, so most of this region we're talking about is in the valleys where people live. We're typically talking between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. Lower than that if you're in Phoenix, but we're in a very low humidity situation. So the other really distinct thing is 40-degree swings between daily highs and lows are not at all uncommon. In fact, we're in that period, like right now, speaking to you here in mid-November, 70 degrees and down into the 30s at night is pretty typical of nights that are clear, which are a lot of nights. We average between 11 and 12 inches of rainfall a year. And one of the very distinct things about this region that defines us, we're very different from other deserts in that we're in our boreal desert. And the reason we're in our boreal desert is because a little over half of our rainfall arrives in the summertime. So our rainfall is typically split between storms that come in from the Pacific in the winter, and those typically feature more gentle rainfall. And then we have this period that begins in and around the middle of June through September, called the monsoon season, where subtropical moisture from Mexico bubbles up, and typically it begins with thunderstorms over the mountains, and the winds push those down into the valleys, and those are more violent rain, not uncommon to get a half inch or an inch in a half hour in a storm, in some of these storms. And those storms make our normally dry seasonal washes fill up and overflow and sometimes flood. So that's the kind of the weather and seasonal conditions that are typical here.
I know it's fascinating for a Midwesterner like myself, and also people from the East Coast or the Pacific Northwest. When I'm visiting friends and family in Tucson, if there's a rain event, people will call each other and ask how much rain they got. Oh, I got a quarter inch. Oh, I got 3/8 of an inch. It's like, that's like a little drizzle where we live, but in Tucson, it's extremely significant just to get any amount of moisture. So it's a really challenging gardening environment.
Yeah, the lack of water makes it very challenging. And you're right. Like, we all have rain gauges, and it's a common. I mean, even like, hey, I got 3/10. we'll talk. People keep track of every little bit.
It's amazing. So if someone was new to your area, how would you describe what it's like to garden with native plants in your ecoregion? And what factors are a priority to consider for your gardens to thrive?
So what's different about it here is a lot of things, almost everything. I often tell people that gardening in Tucson, it's a little like, if we have any Star Wars fans, it's a little like gardening on the planet Tatooine. So we don't quite have two suns. Tatooine and Star Wars has two suns, but it sometimes feels like we have two suns, because the heat is really intense. And the flip side that we don't talk about, so we always talk about the first thing that comes to people's mind is the heat, but the other part of it is we're cold. So the limiting factor on a lot of plants is not the high summer temperatures, it's the winter lows. We had two So a little bit like right now we have this Arctic air that's sinking down. I don't know if it's over you in Wisconsin, but I saw that the jet stream was pushing this plume of Arctic air down over the Midwest. And occasionally now, and this may be something even related to global warming, but the jet stream is really variable. So there were 2 years in the like 2011, 2014, where that air made it clear down over the entire state of Arizona. You know, we had lows in the teens and even in the single digits in the lowest parts of Tucson, we had like 9 degrees. So that is also another challenging factor. So the lack of rainfall, the cold winter temperatures, the high summer temperatures. The other part that is difficult is our soil has very low organic content. And so we're working with often compacted tight soils and with sometimes a substrate called caliche, which is a calcium carbonate that builds up because the rain can't leach the salts out of the soil. And so you get this kind of layers of this stuff. And when you hit it with your shovel, it feels like cement. It's really awful. So those are some of the conditions. Those are the difficult things. That being said, we are the center of the universe for cactus horticulture and growing. And there are lots and lots of species we can grow here. We're this weird little pocket that's different than almost any place else in the US, where we can grow lots and lots of different cactus species.
So why is it that you can grow so many different cactus compared to other regions in the Sonoran Desert or a related area?
Well, I wouldn't say so. It's not necessarily, I was speaking more of the Sonoran Desert, the wider region. It's not Tucson specifically, but
I see.
When I talk about us being the center of the universe, I would say that there are probably more cactus growers and nursery and horticulturists here doing that than any place else. So when I go shopping for cactus for clients' gardens, it's not unusual for me to run into tourists from Germany or other places that have come specifically to buy cactus because we have some fantastic places to buy them, things you can't get anywhere else.
And they travel well on an airplane long distances, don't they?
They do. You know, you have to be a little bit careful when you coming and going from airports, and you don't things that are on the CITES list. You do not want to be bringing across borders unless you end up, don't want to end up incarcerated.
Got it. So, Scott, most of the U.S. has experienced some degree of climate change in the last 10 to 20 years. What climate condition changes have you observed over this time in your area?
So that's a really good question. And I touched on the cold part of this in the last question. But what I would say is that the variance in the jet stream in just the cold winter Arctic lows sinking down into our area, that's something that I have not seen. Then we had, of course, what's in the news right now and has been for many years is we're in this extended drought period. We're nearing a crisis level on the Colorado River. It's over allocated, and a big portion of Tucson's water comes from the Central Arizona Project, which is water from the Colorado River. And so all of that is being reassessed. We already are our residential water use in Tucson is very low. We're one of the lowest per capita per day in the whole country. So that there's not a ton more we can do at a residential level, but that water scarcity is increasing, and we have tiered water rates. So the more you use, the more the water costs you here. So that's the primary water and lack thereof that's the primary concern related to climate change.
I think
Go ahead.
I think what's particularly impressive when I'm visiting Tucson, I see almost no lawns. And many years ago, I climbed up to Finger Rock on the northeast side of town and looked over the entire city of Tucson, and you could hardly see. There was one golf course that had lawn. Everything else was cacti, succulents, etc. So the people of Tucson have been way ahead of the curve on this for many years.
Yeah, that is true, and it's actually, I went to college out of state, and one of the reasons I moved back to Tucson was that it's one of the only places in the country where turf grass is not valued highly as a landscape ground covering, and it is pretty unique. And even now, that golf course that you saw from the foothills,
yeah,
that was, if it's the one I'm thinking of, a large one has just been converted back to a wildlife park. So the turf is gone, and it became untenable. And the popularity of golf here, we exceeded the number of courses to the number of golfers. So we're in the process of converting some of those back to wild areas now.
That's wonderful. That's fantastic. So the trend is positive, continuing.
Yeah.
So what benefits or improvements can a homeowner make by using native plants and in their landscaping to help mitigate the effect of these climate change events? Like, I know 2 years ago, the monsoons failed. And so you didn't even have you got half of your normal rainfall for the year, like less than 8 inches, right?
Yeah. There's been a few years that the monsoon doesn't materialize, and that is super hard on plants because that is their growing season. Most of the there are cool season growers and warm season growers here, but probably a high percentage of the plants we have here do their thing in the summertime. So when the monsoon doesn't happen, those plants won't bloom, they don't produce seed, they'll start to die back. So things like Palo Verde trees, their response to drought is to drop branches. So they basically they'll do a kind of a summer deciduous thing, and then they'll start just dropping branches. And even super tough plants, such as one of the plants we have on my plan, which is a fantastic plant for the desert here, is jojoba. But I for 25 years, I've made a weekly hike or bike ride through Saguaro National Park East. And during that summer, when the rains failed, I started noticing that the jojobas that were there's a paved road that runs through that park, and the jojobas that were on the uphill side of that weren't getting runoff from the roadway were losing leaves. Like it's typically always evergreen, and jojoba's so well adapted, it can angle its leaves it changes the angles of the leaves to the sun. It's amazing. But it even couldn't, the conditions get that bad. And you see things like prickly pear, when the drought is extended, prickly pear, the pads will completely shrivel up, and eventually some of the pads just die, and the plant shrinks in size because the pads are dying. So that's the bad part of like when we get a super exceptional drought and the rains fail. Like if the spring rains fail and the summer rains fail, that's when you start getting those extreme events. But I will say, so there's advantages to the homeowner for planting native plants here are that the plants live. That's the big advantage, is that you're not fighting against the climate. And these plants, their evolutionary history is long enough here that most of the plants have seen that they have it built into their system to endure these conditions. Whereas where you're working with other plants that you just don't, there's lots of potential pitfalls for planting exotics. I'll give you one is like we have a fungus in the soil here that comes out during the high humidity, high summer temperatures. And it's evolved here. It's been here forever. But exotics tend to get, so some of the like Australian acacias that get planted here, and sometimes African sumacs that get planted here, they will succumb to this, it's Texas root rot is what it's called. And they will succumb to it like within a week. You have like a tree that's thriving and then a tree that's dead. But the advantage of native trees is they've evolved with this fungus in the soil, so they're not susceptible to this particular root rot.
So would it be safe to say that by using native plants properly selected for the moisture situation, whether it has drier hillsides or moisture valley areas, that you can establish really attractive, sustainable gardens that require very little maintenance, they're adapted to the soils, and the only time you would have to water them would be during extreme drought like you had a couple of years ago. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement. And the caveat I would add would be, you need the plants, once the plants are well established, and that might be 2 or even 3 summers of supplementally watering them to where you've got plants that are really kind of ready to thrive on their own. And as you know from your nursery, when we plant plants, sometimes the root to shoot ratio is not positive. So we've got more plant above ground than we do below ground, and we need to try to balance that out and get the root system strong before we start. We want to make sure the plants are healthy and thriving before we cut them off of water.
Got it. And that brings us to really the heart of the matter here. Can you tell us about your approach to developing a native garden design in your area?
Yeah. So I think I'll speak a little bit to the sample plan that I created here too. So I love doing gardens here because the plants are so sculptural. So a lot of our plants, they just have a form that's different than lots of things that you see in other parts of the country. So plants like yuccas, agaves, plants that are in the woody lily family that are actually related to asparagus, which is crazy, but they are. Those plants, to me, it's almost like they're alive, but they're this living sculpture that changes, and they're a big presence in the garden. So after trees, those are the next when I design, I place the trees first, based on the exposure and what we're trying to do. And then those other plants go in next, and they're kind of like exclamation points in the garden. So they rise up above, and they're definitely eye-catching. And I like to use enough of those that your eye moves across the plan the garden once it's installed. So there's a rhythm to it, and so I love doing that. And then after that, I want to use, we move to shrubs, and I want to use tough shrubs that have interest year round and also are attractive to lots of different species of birds, butterflies, insects. And I'll give you, and this is kind of relates back to what we were just talking about in terms of maintenance. I don't design anything that needs more than quarterly maintenance. So you shouldn't have to go into your garden more than 4 times a year to do anything other than enjoy it. And sometimes we just mess things up maintenance is bad sometimes. So I'll give you an example. Is I had this over the course of the pandemic, I have these agaves that I planted 20 years ago. It's agave salmiana. It's pulque agave. They bloomed, shot up these giant asparagus-looking 20-foot bloom stalks, like 10 inches caliper diameter on the bloom stalks, huge yellow flowers. So one morning, my wife wakes me up and it's like, you have to come out here. And so I go out, and there are 7 hooded orioles in this one agave bloom stalk, just mobbing it. And the nighttime, we have bats using them. I let those bloom stalks stand and they dry out. And a lot of people will cut them down at this point, but they are this incredible home for carpenter bees. And then the Gila woodpeckers come to to get the insects out. So it's wildlife services like all the way through. And so there's another colleague here, Brad Lancaster, who does rainwater harvesting. And I quote him, he says, don't do something, just stand there. And that's a lot. That's a great, I find more and more that is true on these native gardens. Sometimes if we want to do what let the plants do what they do. And it really breaks my heart. I see sometimes people will cut an agave bloom stalk off as it starts to come up before it blooms. And the plant has waited, like this is its one chance to procreate. And people cut it short and the plant is not going to live. They're what we call monocarpic. So they bloom one time and they die. Cutting the bloom stalk does not prevent that. So sorry, I got off on it was a bit of a rant there about agave maintenance.
No, that's really great. We have the same thing here, of course, in the prairies where we leave everything stand for wildlife, for pollinators, for habitat, same thing. And as you pointed out, being monocarpic, the agaves can grow for 20 to 70 years and then finally do their one and only flowering, make seeds and die. And so I would assume you would successionally plant agaves if you wanted to have an ongoing population of those in a garden. Is that something that you would pursue?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There are two ways that agaves propagate: by seed or by offset. So and offsets are sometimes called pups, and those are little baby plants that are basically part of the root of the mother plant, springs up and makes babies below it. So these particular ones that bloomed at my house, I already had a juvenile replacement when the mother plant bloomed. So it's gone, and now I have one that's looking teenage. It's looking like a preteen in the garden.
That's great. Hey, can I ask you one more question about the structure of your gardens? Because for people that are not familiar with your ecoregion and the plants in your ecoregion, when you say you start with the trees, most people in the Midwest or the East would think of trees that can grow 50 to 100 feet tall. How tall do your trees grow? And then that would be your upper layer. Then you would have the smaller shrubs that are in the second layer, and then you have your succulents, cacti, and wildflowers at the third layer. Is that correct, Scott?
That's correct. The way I design, I would put the agaves, the succulents, or sometimes called accent plants, so cactus, agaves. I actually do those second, and then the shrubs. So, but the trees in our region, they're very different. So this is one thing that people have to get used to. We don't have a bur oak native equivalent here. We have some native oaks. So Tucson is kind of at the eastern edge of the Sonoran Desert, and we're transitioning into the Chihuahuan Desert. And up off the desert floor, all surrounding Tucson, and then toward the southeast, we're quickly into an oak grassland setting where we have native oaks like emery oak and Mexican blue oak, mixed in with a lot of grasses that actually you would recognize from your part of the prairie. So those, which I know we traveled there a little together. Those plants, so some of those oaks actually will do well in Tucson gardens if you wanted a tree like oak, but our native trees are going to be things like mesquite, palo verde, acacia. Those are kind of the trinity of desert trees, and then desert willows, trees like that. And those are smaller. So we're talking trees that are in like the 15 to 25 foot high and wide range. Sometimes, 30, 35 feet if we're talking about bigger, older trees. They tend to be more umbrella shaped. So typically things like a mesquite are typically wider than it is tall. They're multi-trunked. These are not the trees you draw in school as a child of a lollipop looking plant. Multi-trunk is the natural habitat. And in nature, those trees' branches would be sweeping the ground. So they would grow clear to the ground. We prune them up for landscapes for our purposes so people could walk underneath them. But in nature, that is not the case.
And then do you have shade tolerant plants that you're able to plant underneath those trees to associate with them, as well as sun loving shrubs and cacti?
We do. And the advantage of a lot of these desert trees too is this is certainly not the sort of shade you would expect from a maple or oak in your part of the country. So it's definitely a more filtered shade. So a lot of the succulents, for instance, a lot of agave plants really, really like the shade of like a mesquite, for instance, because it's a dappled shade. It's not going to be a dense, dark shade. So there's actually lots of opportunities for planting in the understory of those trees.
I know that when I'm in the Sonoran Desert, you typically see more reproduction of understory plants on the north side of trees rather than on the south side because of the shade effect, the getting more shade there. Is that fairly typical? And do you use that technique in your gardens?
That's a good question. In general, I would say in general, a lot of desert trees are what we call nurse trees. And there's a real association, especially with things like, so our iconic saguaro cactus, you'll often see them like growing like right next to a Palo Verde tree, like straight up through the branches, like a foot from the main trunk. And you think, wow, it chose an odd place. But the saguaro will outlive the Palo Verde tree. So eventually, sometimes there's mechanical damage where the plant and the tree are rubbing against each other. There's definitely an association. I don't know so much if it's always the north side. I think it just kind of depends where those seeds fall and where there's moisture. And but there's definitely a strong association between a lot of plants. They're going to use that little extra shade and extra moisture. And a lot of our desert trees are legumes. So they're in the bean family and they are nitrogen fixers. So I mentioned that our soils don't have much organic matter, but underneath those trees, there's going to be more organic matter and a better soil and mycorrhiza and all sorts of beneficial things for plants.
It's fascinating that you point out that many cacti will live longer than some of the trees. So what sort of life expectancy do you see for like a mesquite, a Palo Verde, a jojoba, or any of these sorts of trees and shrubs? Are we talking 20 years, 50 years versus a saguaro that can live hundreds of years?
Yeah, I don't have I get this question a lot and I wish I had a better answer. I could go count tree rings, I guess. All I will say is that I see a lot of, I don't know exactly how long those trees live, but saguaros are certainly in the hundreds of years, and some large barrel cactus seem to go a long, long time. Like some of these plants that I joke with cactus that some of these species are so long lived that you may need to choose an heir to take care of these because they do live a long time. But what I observe in nature is that you'll see Palo Verde trees dying and then a saguaro, like a skeleton of a tree with a saguaro like shooting up through that skeleton frequently.
Cool. So looking at this garden you've designed, tell us about the changes from season to season and what kind of wildlife it will attract at various times of the year.
Okay, so I will say that to talk about this a little bit overall, the one thing I always like to emphasize with people when we're talking about desert design is people have this idea that a desert garden has to be one way. Like to use desert plants, it needs to be really kind of naturalistic, asymmetric, wild looking. And that is a great way to design a garden, but there's lots of different ways to use desert plants. So they can be used in a formal way, in a symmetrical way. That's a little more work, because if a plant dies in a symmetrical garden, then you're all of a sudden asymmetrical. um, so I tried to make this design, and I use some techniques that I've used with clients' gardens in giving it kind of a contemporary, clean edge, but using the native plants in a really interesting way to add interest, to make it low maintenance, to attract wildlife. So some of the central plants, we'll start with trees, is we've used native mesquite trees, which are long-lived, super drought tolerant. They have what I call desert character. The desert character is a multi-trunked tree with kind of, as they get older, they get gnarly bark, and they have very gray-green leaves. They spread out in an umbrella shape. So those are the two mesquites are the two kind of anchor plantings. We have one in the front and one in the rear. And they are a tree. The one in the rear is located adjacent to a rainwater harvesting basin. So mesquite trees, they can stand to be flooded in terms of rain. They like that. They'll just grow faster. And then we've used plants like desert willows. So desert willows, they're in the Bignonia family. And so the mesquites and the desert willows are both deciduous trees. The desert willows make this incredible flower that comes out. It's kind of after the spring wildflowers, the desert willows bloom, and they have a fantastic scent. So when they're budded, you can smell them from a long ways away. The native varieties come in a bunch of colors, for everything from a pure clear white to a burgundy, with lots of variations between, and lots of different pink shades. The shade that's almost like a bougainvillea pink is common too. So the desert willows are there's three of those in the trunk, and they're excellent for using around, and you can plant them right in a rainwater basin. They have what are called adventitious roots, and those are roots that can be flooded and even have soil built up on the roots. And basically the trunk can grow new roots, kind of out the side if the plant got covered up with wet soil or water. So yeah, that's that. And then we've used an evergreen. So some of the bigger plants we have are Texas mountain laurel. That's a Sephora, so you might recognize that genus name. That's a Chihuahuan desert plant, and it's an evergreen, and it blooms these grape-colored flowers, and they smell exactly like grape soda. They have a smell like an artificial grape flavor or grape chewing gum. And so that's an early spring bloomer. So we have plants that are blooming in spring, and then we kind of go through. I'll just mention. I know I won't touch on every single plant, but for accent plants, we have a large yucca, and it's a trunk forming yucca. So this is a plant that's going to get it. It could be the tallest plant in the garden, and that's Faxon's yucca. So I've seen these, and it's another Chihuahuan desert species, huge, broad, sword-shaped leaves, up to as tall as like 25, 30 feet tall. So that's an accent plant that's right in the back corner. We have other agave species in the garden. So we have octopus agave. We have artichoke agave. Artichoke agave is a Perry's agave that's a small rosette form, and that's growing kind of underneath the mesquite tree in the front part of the garden. The octopus agave are under the mesquite in the back garden. And those octopus agave are canyon plants, so they actually grow out of canyon walls in really narrow canyons. So you'll see they're very adapted to shade. So some places in canyons, plants that grow on canyon walls are really good, typically for what I call situations where you have like, you need a switch hitter. Like it's going to be sunny there sometimes, but sometimes it might be quite shady depending on the season. And so that's what the octopus agave is doing. And so our plants are spaced a little bit further apart. And I think that is an opportunity to do some things by seed later on. So this plant also has included a wildflower list by seed, and that helps knit the garden. Knit it together. So that's kind of my general design approach. Maybe
so the wildflowers. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
So the wildflowers kind of serve as a ground layer to accent the more structural elements of the garden at the different levels.
Right. And I would say, I would qualify that by saying it's an ephemeral and seasonal ground cover. So there, we have two different seasons of wildflowers. They're going to riot briefly and then hibernate depending on rainfall and temperature.
So that brief riot is the annuals that come after a good winter rain and are generally obvious late March through May, something like that. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's another kind of maybe sometimes February through. The wildflowers they're very opportunistic. So if we get a week of temperatures like in the high 70s or 80s in February, and there's already wildflowers germinated, they will sometimes just go all at once. It could last if the season is kind of like moderate and the temperatures moderate, your wildflowers last a long time. If sometimes we just like blast through 80 degrees and we're pushing 90, sometimes all your wildflowers do their thing in like 2 weeks.
So what percentage of those wildflowers are annuals and what percentage are perennials, Scott?
So the general rule is the drier the desert, the higher percentage of the wildflowers are annuals versus perennials. So I have a mix of them here. We're using a mix of annual and perennial wildflowers. So things like Mexican gold poppy, lupine, those are going to be annual wildflowers, whereas things like Perry's penstemon and desert marigolds, which we're planting as plants, are perennial wildflowers. And some of these are, like desert marigold, it's this gorgeous silvery plant with like big yellow daisies. I've seen it bloom every month of the year here. I mean, it'll grow out of the crack in a sidewalk. It's very opportunistic as to when it will bloom. So that they don't all have regular patterns and they don't all bloom in the spring. I've also included on the wildflower list here, summer blooming, so monsoon blooming flowers. So we have things like summer poppy, which is a creosote relative of all things. And that actually blooms during the summer months, during the monsoon.
So based upon these different bloom times and behavior patterns between annuals, perennials, etc., and cool season and warm season, how do you structure or time the sowing of your wildflower seeds in your gardens?
So there are 2 times a year to sow. The first time is in the fall, and almost any time in the fall, but typically from late September even into mid-December. And I always watch the weather and see if there are Pacific storms lined up coming. If it's raining in San Diego, it will usually be raining here.
Because if you got to catch that rain, or you might not have results. Just a single big rain event all makes all the difference, right?
Yeah, if it's a big like slow moving, you can see like a big slow moving Pacific storm is just ideal. Or they're lined up like you see them coming down from the Gulf of Alaska, and they're saying, okay, this one's in San Diego, this one's coming down the coast. Then that's a great time to go out and sow your wildflower seeds in the fall. And you can enhance that by going out and keeping the soil moist with a hose. But in general, I like to try to time it so I'm not having to do that. I only give my lettuces like 3 times a day water to germinate.
So will you re-sow wildflowers every year, every other year, or once you get a good bloom, do you have enough seed bank in there to sustain that over the life of the garden?
So this is something I talk a lot about with clients, and it's once you get these plants going, you get enough seed down, and you get a big bloom. You build up a seed bank in the soil, and it's an incredible thing because the seeds, they're this living DNA that's in your garden that knows when to germinate and knows, like, they can sit for years. Some of these desert seeds have a super hard coating on them, and they just wait. And so that's the great thing about doing wildflowers is if you keep on it, and you do have to keep the weeds down, you have to keep the competition down too, until you get rid of most of the weeds, and then it becomes actually really easy, and your wildflowers are just going to do their thing.
So in the first couple of years, you'll control weeds to make sure they don't go to seed, so only your wildflowers go to seed, and then you gain control over that environment. Wow, that's great. Well, I'm kind of jealous of your gardens because you have all these fragrant plants like the white thorn acacia, the Texas mountain laurel, and then with their beautiful fragrant flowers, and then you've got the creosote that after a rain, what you call the smell of the desert, which to me, having lived in Colorado, is the smell of the sagebrush after an afternoon shower. I mean, it's just the most wonderful fragrance, and you've got all these plants that are adding not just color and structure and texture to the garden, but also fragrance. So that's pretty amazing. So tell us more about how this design supports and preserves plant and wildlife species native to your local ecosystems.
So we've got there's a lot of different plants that support wildlife in different ways. I'll touch on one that I haven't talked about yet, and that is tuberosa. So tuberosa it's a justicia, and that in tuberosa means hummingbird in Spanish. And it's one word for, there's a couple words for hummingbirds, but it's one word for hummingbird. And that plant is really cool because it's the winter nectar plant for hummingbirds. So there are not very many plants in the winter. It's like right now, it's cold at night already, and most of my plants are going dormant. But I have these tuberosas that are on the south side of my garden, and they basically will lose their leaves, and it's kind of these semi-succulent looking sticks, but little tiny tubular red flowers come out during the winter months when the plant doesn't have any leaves on it. And that I can watch hummingbirds every day off those two. And I have 2 of these plants in my backyard, and I've watered them, I think 3 times when I first planted them 20 years ago. And they're still there, and they're blooming. And the tuberosa flowers are also interesting because they're edible, and you can put them in a salad if you wanted to. They're an edible flower. They taste like cucumber. That's one example. Another one that we have. So we have a desert milkweed. I know I can see the milkweeds behind you in your backdrop, Neil. This is our milkweed, which is if you looked at it almost like right off the bat, you might not even put it as a milkweed. So ours actually looks like a succulent. The leaves are not much to look at. It's mostly stem with these white, kind of creamy white flowers, but it's it's both a larval and a nectar plant for butterflies. And so I was just noticing I was out yesterday in my garden, and I noticed that I've got caterpillars all over my milkweed right now. So they're doing their thing. And it's
caterpillars. What kind of caterpillars?
I think that they are queen butterfly. I meant to look it up. I'm sorry, I don't know exactly, but I think they're queen butterflies. One of the butterflies we have here that definitely uses this plant.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Wow. But so it's a wonderful plant. It's super tough and it reseeds around the garden too. So once you plant desert milkweed, you typically might get some seedlings popping up around, and it's just kind of one of the toughest of the tough. It's maybe it certainly ranks as one of our toughest perennial plants here. And it's a pretty silvery green color. It goes with everything. And again, provides those wildlife services.
Are there any other particular insects that you find that have a particular value in your gardens, or other invertebrates that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, let's see. So I mentioned the desert willow trees. Both the mesquites and desert willows they're enormous. Well, actually, and the acacia, all the trees in this garden are fantastic for bees. So you may have heard of mesquite honey is a thing, and it's a great flavorful local honey from around here. So both European honeybees and lots of native bee species and solitary bee species use these trees. Desert willows are cool in that when they're blooming, so the flowers are fragrant for us as humans, but you'll often see butterflies, hummingbirds. You'll see butterflies and hummingbirds on the flowers at the same time. So you kind of get all of these wildlife services on the same plant.
Wow. I know that Doug Tallamy, in his studies at the University of Maryland, found that the genus Salix, willows, was one of the highest utilized genera of all woody plants by pollinators. So you have this great opportunity to use your native willow in your designs. That's pretty amazing. That's great. And you don't think of the desert as having, willows, because willows like moisture. So it's really interesting that you have these species that are drought tolerant. So speaking of water, your design recommends installing a drip irrigation system to help get your plants established. So can you tell us a little bit about the benefits of drip irrigation, why it's necessary, the logistics of installation, and how long after your plants are installed it should run for?
Okay, sure. So drip irrigation, it's anybody that lives in the desert very long gets a relationship with drip irrigation systems. It doesn't always start well. A lot of people inherit an old system that maybe wasn't set up right and may have some problems. So there are some downsides to it, but there are some significant upsides. So what drip irrigation does is it pinpoints the watering exactly to where a plant's root zone is. That's the main advantage. So for water conservation, it's the gold standard. It applies the water slowly enough that even if the plant's on a slope, you're not going to erode the soil around a plant's roots because you're applying it so slow. You can tailor the water use to individual plants. So drip emitters come in various gallon per hour emitters. So anywhere from half a gallon an hour up to like 4 gallons an hour, you can choose from. So there's a lot of advantages that way. Sometimes I wish we didn't have to use any irrigation, drip or otherwise, just because it is, it's a system that's complex, and we're running basically a flexible black polytubing that's then that's connected to what we call spaghetti tubing that goes to each plant. And there is the possibility of putting a shovel through the flexible tubing. It's pretty easily repairable, but there are things to watch out for. But anyway, we want to put it in mainly because we want to get the plants established and off to a good start. And the rainfall can be fickle, and this lets you easily water the plants. And typically the rule is for perennials and ground covers, plants that are small with relatively shallow roots. You want to water long enough to where the irrigation goes down to 1 foot. For shrubs, like medium-sized shrubs, small to medium shrubs, you want to water to a depth of 2 feet. And then for trees, you want to go down to 3 to 4 feet. So it's basically the way to summarize that is the trees need deep, infrequent irrigation. Where some of the more perennial plants would prefer shallow, more frequent irrigation, and then the shrubs are somewhere in between. So the drip irrigation, the components for a typical residential garden, you would typically have 2 valves at the minimum. So one for trees and one for trees and woody shrubs. You can also, because the succulents, so some of the succulents, for instance, agaves and yuccas, they like the similar schedule to a tree. So you could put those on the same zone as the trees in terms of frequency of watering, but with an emitter that puts out less gallons per hour. So that's one strategy to keep the system relatively simple. And then, of course, the other one would be for your perennials, so 2 different lines. And that would run, cost-wise, you're looking for a homeowner system that includes a backflow preventer, a clock, 2 valves, all the components. At a cost somewhere between like $800 and $1,200, depending on what you've chosen. And there's different options for those systems.
So would that be roughly equivalent to the cost of moderate-sized plants, or would that be a lesser cost than the actual plants? I realize, of course, it depends upon the size of the pots that you've purchased the plants in. Is that calculable?
I'm sorry, I'm not exactly following your question, Neil. Can you repeat your question?
So I'm going to invest $1,000 in my irrigation system. How much should I pay for the plants on average that irrigation system is serving? And I realize it's variable because of the size of the pots that you're using. So smaller material is cheaper, larger material is more. Maybe that's a really difficult question because of those variables. I'm just trying to get an idea of what this design would cost me to install.
Yeah. So in general, like I've recommended in the notes that we do the smallest. You choose the smallest plants possible is what I would recommend. Unfortunately, it seems that the nurseries here now have some of these plants used to be offered in smaller sizes, and they're not offered in smaller sizes anymore. So we're looking at buying bigger plants, unfortunately. So that definitely affects. But I would say the retail cost for plants now for 1 gallon plants here typically runs from $5 to $10 per plant, and then as much as 12 on certain species. But then your 5 gallons, you're looking more in the like $16 to $28 range, and then 15-gallon plants like $60 to $120, and so that's a range. I don't have a
Sure.
total for you. And there are some great resources. So some of the plants on this plan, like fishhook barrel, that's a plant that our local cactus and succulent society, we have one of the most active cactus and succulent societies in the United States here. And they salvage fishhook barrels all the time from construction sites where they're in the way of development, and those plants are sold to the general public. And so those are offered like at a bargain rate, so you can get actually a really big, mature fishhook barrel. So we have like some nonprofits. There's a nonprofit nursery called Desert Survivors that offers a bunch of wonderful natives in 1 gallons, and that they have there's sales throughout the year. There's the botanical garden sales. There's lots of different ways to acquire these plants.
Sure, got it. All right. Well, speaking of cost, et cetera, can you talk a little bit about proper placing of plants so that they can thrive to their best ability and prevent overcompetition between them, and also to minimize the cost by not planting the plants too closely together and then seeing them decline due to excessive competition?
Yes, yeah. So one of the things that's different about gardening here is I think people are, if you're used to kind of an English garden model where the plants are all overlapping each other and all touching, is in most residential desert gardens, your plants are going to be spaced further apart. So, if you were to plant desert plants cheek by jowl throughout a typical garden and water all those plants, you could possibly use almost as much water as you would if you planted turf. So that's the sad truth of it. The plants are more drought tolerant, but actually the typical turf grass here, Bermuda grass, is actually amazingly tough and is even naturalized in some places. So the part of it is a water conservation matter, and then we just giving the plants room again so they don't have root competition. And then it does give us room for some of those seasonal annuals to plant in between these plants. So the plants that we do by seed, and again, that's what I talk about in terms of knitting the landscape together. The more I go out in the desert, you see that the bigger plants are further apart. Like if you look at a flat with a bunch of creosote, the creosote space themselves naturally far enough apart to where they're not competing with each other. So it's a pattern, but if you look closer, there's also small plants growing. It's not just bare ground between the plants. So that's kind of what I shoot for as much as possible. And, you're also kind of up against like many communities here. They don't do well at letting people's native plants go through their whole life cycle. They want you to remove them right away. They see them as weeds. So like your wildflowers, if your wildflowers bloom out and they dry up and you're letting the seeds ripen, sometimes I have clients that get letters from a homeowners association saying, remove this. So I sometimes have to write some artfully worded letters to make sure that these plants can at least stay till their seeds ripen.
So it would be fair to say that a desert garden in your region you would see more quote unquote specimen plants spaced widely apart as compared to an English border garden where plants are closely associated with each other. That's pretty accurate.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah. And it sometimes when I do a garden, like the day after a garden, like we install the garden, and then I have clients tell me, well, there's not enough plants. And I always advise them, I say, give it a year. Let's wait a year. We come back in a year. And if you still think that there's not enough, because, and this is true of gardening anywhere, sometimes people can't see how big a plant's going to get. And yeah.
So related to the plant spacing, can you talk about the impact of impermeable surfaces that you would be using in your gardens and their impact on the landscape and surrounding areas and why they're important?
Okay, great. Yeah. So as I mentioned, this kind of goes back, Neil, to what we talked about with rainfall and when the rainfall comes. So we want to maximize the use of rainfall. So Tucson, actually, we get enough rainfall that we should be able to keep all these plants alive. But what we tend to do is, the way houses are built, is it's to shed the rainwater immediately off the property into a gutter, down a storm drain exits into a wash fills up and floods low-lying homes. And so we're trying to slow the water down, retain more of it on site. We still have to have a way for the water to leave the property when we do get a really, really big rain. We don't want your backyard to fill up like a bathtub, but we do want some rainwater basins to fill up. And so the hardscapes in this plan, they're what I call floating concrete. So they're not non-contiguous pads. that allow the rainwater to flow off the sides. And then in this particular garden, like in the back, those floating pads, I have plants spaced around in those. You can have them in the gaps between the slabs of concrete. So your concrete slabs are letting you, walk out in barefoot to get out to a patio area, but they're also shedding rainwater in a beneficial way to the plants because we didn't do one big contiguous surface that all slopes out to the street.
So how big are these concrete plants, Scott? What's their dimension?
The dimensions on them, they vary. The pads, and I actually don't have my ruler. I have the pen in front of me right now, but I do not have my scaled ruler. And I did not
They're just
memorize
little walking paths, right?
They're just yeah. There's one that's more of the patio that's directly adjacent to the house, and then there's the floating slabs that go back to another little sitting area, like kind of to sit more in the garden. And I believe they're like 4x6, the floating ones, and then there's one bigger pad. But they're all designed to shed the rainwater out into the garden.
And then it's just like when you drive around the roads, paved roads in your area, you'll see much denser vegetation at the edge of the pavement where the water sheds off and the plants get extra water. So you're using that same concept in the garden?
Absolutely correct. Yeah. And like I mentioned earlier when we were talking about climate change, the jojoba, even in the worst part of the drought, the jojobas that were on the uphill side of a paved road were going into severe stress. The ones on the downhill side looked fine. So, even in kind of the worst situation, that you can definitely help a lot. Like you're, doubling or tripling the water those plants would get.
Sure. So can you tell us a little more, go into more detail about the 4 rainwater harvesting basins and the mechanics and their function during the monsoons when you get a lot of rain, and how all that fits together and works in the garden.
Okay. So one of the cool things about Tucson is we were one of the first municipalities to offer incentives for homeowners to install different rainwater features in their gardens. So you can actually get money from the municipality to install things like gutters, rainwater basins, even rainwater harvesting tanks. There's money available through the city periodically through a grant to do that. In this garden, I've opted for the simplest way, which would be to basically gutter your roof slope. And I have on the corners, each corner, we would have a downspout that would be exiting water into a rainwater harvesting basin. And so there's 4 different basins in the plan. And that's the simplest way. There's nothing mechanical. Gravity is doing all the work. And the rainwater basically would fill up those basins and then percolate in. And the trees that are planted adjacent to these the tree roots would take advantage of the water. I have one of the plants. There's another plant that's specifically used in conjunction with that. And that's a plant called golden dogweed. And it's a little low growing perennial, and it's super tough, but it loves rainwater basins. So it will spread all over in a rainwater basin. So it's a really great plant to have in these basins like this as well. So yeah, basically the basins are designed to supplementally water and eventually be the sole water source for most of the large woody plants, the trees that we've got.
Got it. So what are some of the things that really need to be considered prior to the planting? I know you talked a little bit about correcting soil problems, caliche. I mean, I know for people in your region, an indispensable garden tool is a pickaxe. So what other sorts of preparation do you need to take into consideration prior to actually installing the plants?
Well, it's sometimes I joke that it's sometimes more akin to mining than gardening here. It's it really are. So soil conditions vary a lot in Tucson Valley. So we do have some, but I would say in general the soil, the digging is very tough. There's very it's a small minority of jobs that I work in that we could plant any plant, a 1 gallon plant even with a shovel. So the digging is often so tough that we're using a pickaxe to plant 1 gallon plants. And a 40-pound electric jackhammer is an essential tool of every landscape crew when they use that with a spade bit. And the jackhammer with the spade bit is probably the most used tool on any kind of residential, like anybody that's doing this professionally. And lots of homeowners rent them too. So,
wow.
So our soil is rough, and I mentioned earlier, probably the biggest problem that you encounter, and sometimes you won't know till you start digging actually that you've got this, but we have this in some parts of town, and it's usually not over a whole lot. It's typically like will cross a lot in bands, or there'll be a patch of it, but it's called caliche, and it's a calcium carbonate. It's basically like a layer of really compacted salts that never leached through the soil, and over the years it hardened into this. It feels almost like concrete. So there's a couple of ways. So you can plant even like a tree. You could plant a tree in caliche if you can break through. So sometimes caliche is only like 3 inches thick, and sometimes it's like 4 feet thick or more. So you do what's called a planting chimney. So you need to bust through the bottom of your hole till you get to soil that is not caliche, so that when you water, basically it has to drain. But a desert tree can make it even in that if the soil drains. If you can't break through it, then you have to relocate the plant. There's not if you. So that's one of the things. So most of the native plants, amazingly, will grow in this highly mineralized, low organic content soil. Because of construction activities, if it's a new house too, soil can be pretty compacted and sometimes scraped. So you could incorporate some sort of compost and organic content into the soil if it's really, really compromised. But in general, we want to break up the planting when you're so to dig a hole like 3 to 5 times the width of the plant and the same depth. And that increases the tilth enough so that the crumbliness, so that the roots can get out and do their thing. And so we have amazingly good luck with, native soils and native plants. So it's another advantage of using the native plants is they're adapted to it.
So unlike a lot of people in the eastern half of the United States and other regions, non-desert regions, it's common if they're dealing with a heavy clay soil, obviously not caliche, but heavy clay, compacted clay, people will break that up and add organic matter like compost or peat moss or high organic matter topsoil. You're saying you don't have to do that as long as you've selected the right plants and done the proper soil excavation prior to planting. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm saying every case is a little bit different, again, because like I mentioned, if the soil, if the house was recently built in this construction site and they drove heavy equipment all over it, that's a different situation. And so compost is useful for some planting situations, but in general, the soil works. Our native soil works well as long as it's not too compromised. Or sometimes I'll run into a situation too where to grade a new development, the developer just a whole street or site was scraped. So everything whatever little organic content was in the soil is now gone. So everything's a different situation. I'm not against using compost, but it's often not necessary. air.
Got it. Related to site preparation, most gardeners have to deal with weed pressure, no matter where you are. What are some of the recommendations you have for removing weeds in your gardens prior to planting, and how do you prevent them from taking over in the beginning and throughout the lifespan of that garden after installation?
So that's a really good question. We probably do a lot of the same things that you would do. We do get weeds here, like everything from dandelions to puncture weed. We tend, because the rainfall's lower, we don't get perhaps as many of them, but it's certainly when you're doing a garden and you're disturbing soil, you're gonna get new weeds, and especially if we're watering, we're watering plants right around where there wasn't water before, you're going to activate seeds that are in that soil mix. So there's a couple ways of doing it. You could generally, I like to just hand pull everything. Like if I get my clients committed to 2 or 3 seasons of being vigilant, then we all of a sudden have exhausted the weed seeds mostly, and then it's really easy maintenance. So that's my first recommendation. Of course, there's pre-emergence, there's organic herbicides that work somewhat, and to get rid of weeds that come up. It just depends on, our gardens are typically smaller, so it tends to be more manageable in terms of getting rid of them by hand. But that's my recommendation.
And then you like to use screen gravel mulch to help control weeds once the plants are installed.
Correct. So
as opposed to a bark mulch or other organic matter.
Well, I'm not opposed to using organic mulches either, but the predominant aesthetic look for most neighborhoods, and sometimes this is codified into homeowners design. If you live in a neighborhood with a homeowners association, they require some sort of, like in your front yard at least, some sort of gravel ground cover would be required.
Which is not dissimilar from the Sonora Desert.
Yeah, it's not dissimilar. It is a product that's mined. We have what's called, if you go out into undisturbed desert areas, some places have what we would call like a desert pavement, which looks like more or less like gravel. So yeah, there are some advantages to screen gravel. So some of the native plants do not like plants that are rock lovers, that are geophytes, and some cactus and succulents, they wouldn't like a bark mulch right up against their crown, right up over the root zone. You could get what's called damping off from excess moisture getting trapped there. But other plants like in this plan, the mesquite trees, the Texas mountain laurels, the desert willows, those would be fine with a composted mulch, with an inorganic mulch underneath. So it depends on your neighborhood. It depends on the design, but there is an advantage to screened gravel, particularly like there's different diameters of screened gravel. So there's there's 3/8 inch, 3/4 inch, 1 inch. There's all different ways of different sizes of the gravel. But I have noticed in doing all these different clients' gardens that when we do wildflowers, somehow wildflowers really like the gaps, the like spaces between the gravel. So when you do, like, lupine is kind of notoriously finicky to get it to germinate. The seeds are really hard. It helps to soak them overnight. But I had a client that with a large diameter gravel, and we put lupine down, and I was like, we got a bazillion lupine seeds to germinate like the next spring. So for a wildflower seed bed, gravel can be really nice. Whereas on a mulch, it's a little bit harder sometimes to get. It's hard to get soil contact with the seeds. If you're putting wildflower seeds over mulch.
Well, it sounds like gravel is really a pretty darn good choice for a lot of situations.
It is. My only hesitancy in talking about gravel is that it's a mined material. So how we get gravel is we chop down mountains and put it on trucks.
As opposing to chopping down trees and shredding them.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the place in it is true. The place in Tucson is using its waste, so it's green waste. But yeah. Oh.
Cool. So in your designer notes, you mentioned a planting method that is endorsed by the University of Arizona there in Tucson. Can you describe this method?
Yeah, and I touched on this a couple minutes ago. So basically, you want to dig an ample hole, and that is in the width particularly. So 3 to 5 times the width of the container and the same depth. And then you want to rough up the sides. You don't want the sides of the hole. You do not want to be like if it's clay, you can get like almost a veneer on the sides. So you want to rough those sides up. So basically, when the plant roots get out to the area to the edge of the hole you dug, you don't want them to detect that they're in a container and start circling. You want them to be able to keep going out.
Sure.
That's yeah.
Right. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
The university, they tested a bunch of different planting methods for trees, and that method was the best for both lack of the trees blowing over, like getting and kind of growing quick and getting established.
I know here in the Midwest, people will drill holes for trees, and especially in clay, you'll get these very slick, all the way around where the exterior of that diameter, and you put the trees in there, and 25 years over, the tree blows over, and the roots never left outside of that zone, and never penetrated inside that slick layer of clay where the drill was. So it sounds like a similar situation.
Yeah, it is a similar situation. We're finding there are some species of trees. So on this plan, we've used native mesquite trees. And one of my big reasons for using native mesquites is probably the predominant mesquite in Tucson is a South American hybrid mesquite. So it's either some combination of a Chilean or Argentine mesquite. And they're beautiful trees. They grow super fast, like 6 feet a year, 8 feet a year. But they have a problem. They have a real problem blowing over. So these monsoon storms, you'll see whole rows of them blown down. So that's one of the big reasons I've chose that tree. But that also related to some of the problem can be at the nursery. So if they're bumping a plant from a grow tube to a 1 gallon, then a 5 gallon, each time that plant gets moved, what they find is even on the mature tree, you've got circling roots that happened at one of those trans stages, which is another reason that I recommend starting as small as you can, so the plant hasn't been bumped into larger container sizes with possible root problems.
So you actually get a better plant with a smaller plant because it's able to adapt to the growing conditions instead of being contained in a container where it starts off with an incorrect root system.
Correct. And I will, in defense of the nursery business here, some of them they're using these new pots that are designed to prevent that. And they're going kind of direct, they're not shifting in the industry, what they call shifting from a smaller plant container to a bigger one before selling it. They're not doing that as much too. They're planting, like going directly into the size they ultimately want. So which is better.
So in your designer notes, you mentioned the plants that were selected are native to the Sonoran Desert region. And Wild Ones currently has a seedling chapter, a new budding chapter based farther north in Kingman. Would plants from your design be appropriate for a garden in the Mojave Desert or the Chihuahuan Desert? How does that fit for other regions and people in Kingman area and other regions of Arizona?
So that's a really good question. The gardening in our state, if you look at either the USDA maps or even illuminates it more is like this is Sunset Magazine's old garden maps. It's super diverse based on elevation. So, for instance, where I'm sitting right now, I'm probably 20 miles as the crow flies to the top of Mount Lemmon. And that's where I'm sitting is like equivalent to Mexico, and the top of the mountain is like Canada. So it's like going from Hermosillo to Banff in 20 miles. So that's true all over the Southwest. So in Arizona, we have this large uplift called the Mogollon Rim that runs diagonally across the state, and everything on the uphill side of that is ponderosa forest. Everything on the downhill starts to go through all these different ecoregions. Like we're in like an oak region and an oak-teal grassland region. Then you start seeing saguaros, and then you're down all of a sudden back into the Sonoran Desert. So a place like Kingman is higher and colder in a different desert region. So the plants I've chosen are mostly Sonoran Desert plants, but some of these plants are actually Chihuahuan Desert plants too. The Chihuahuan plants have the advantage of taking cold. They're typically more cold hardy. Mm-hmm. So the one plant that wouldn't do well in Kingman is I have 5 jojoba on here, and it's too cold for jojoba in Kingman. But most of the other plants, I'm looking here, a lot of the other plants would do just fine in Kingman. So it could be adapted. You just need to look at the individual species. And there would always be a substitute. Like for the jojoba, if I was doing this garden in Kingman, I would use Arizona rosewood, which is another evergreen, like medium-sized to large shrub, native, and it would do great in Kingman. Or you could use a scrub oak, would do really well there, Quercus turbinella.
So would you say that this garden is good to 3,000 feet, 3,500 feet? What would you say is the maximum elevation in southern Arizona for this garden, south of the Mogollon Rim?
Well, this south of the Mogollon, I think you could go up this. I'm just looking at all the plants. There's one plant, one of the succulents, the slipper plant, which is a petalanthus, a milkweed family plant. Mm-hmm. That plant would not survive the higher elevations, but all that and the jojoba would be the two that, as you got toward 3,500 feet, you're going to be iffy. Good to 3,000. So again, with a couple of small substitutions, this would work in a lot of other desert locations.
Got it. So basically, south of Phoenix.
Yeah. This plant. I mean, this plant could be planted in Phoenix easily, and Phoenix, Tucson, with a couple of substitutions, El Paso. But El Paso is kind of a different thing too. Then we're firmly in the Chihuahuan Desert, and I think Wild Ones is working on another design for that region. So I don't want to talk too much out of school that way. So
got it. Thank you. Just curious as far as where it would be appropriate for people in Arizona. So more or less the southern half of the state.
So the southern half of the state, yeah. So all of the, there's a huge population center now between Tucson and Phoenix. So they call it the Sun Corridor. So Casa Grande and Maricopa, all these towns are actually growing a lot. And this would be appropriate for all of those. It's basically by and large, where the majority of people in the state live. This would be appropriate for.
Got it. So one final question for you, Scott, is the phasing of the installation of your garden. And sometimes an individual may not have the resources or time to install this design all in one. So is there a way you can recommend that a homeowner can install a garden in phases, like a couple phases, as they have the time and money to proceed with that?
Yeah, there certainly is. And what I typically recommend when I run into this with clients is that that we do it, the easiest way by far is to do it geographically. And so that is to, choose the front or the backyard and do one or the other first, depending on what your priority is. And then basically you can get your irrigation system in and get your backflow preventer, your clock, your valves, all of that installed. And then on most gardens that I work in here, unless it's a really, really big space, you only need, like, the lines can run a long way. So you could just cap the lines, the same lines you would have for the front. Say you're doing the front first. You cap those at the line where you're going to stop for the back, and then, save up your money. And then when you're ready to go, you just reconnect to those lines and your expenses are lessened. You would save some money. So the other thing about phasing, if you minimize the number of deliveries of trucks, so you're going to pay, a trip charge for something like a delivery of gravel. And so that if you have a way to stockpile the gravel, like for the second phase of the project, that would also save you money. Those are the best ways. People often want to plant all the trees first, which technically you could do that, but if you do provide drip irrigation to those trees, you are going to need to cover that up, and then you need to come back at a later date when you plant the rest of the plants and uncover the drip and hook the drip up too. So it's a little bit more, you're doubling your work a little bit more that way.
Got it. Well, Scott, this has been fantastic. Is there anything else that you would like to share that we haven't touched on here today? I know we covered a lot of ground, but did we leave anything out that you want to let everybody know about in your garden designs and your native gardens for your region?
I guess I would just say Neil, your questions, and you've been a great host. Thank you for this. But I guess my encouragement would be to not be intimidated by the gardening here, and to get excited about it. It's really different than gardening in most of the rest of the country. And if you can get your head around not trying to replicate what your idea of a garden is from either where you came or idea of a garden you had in your head, and then kind of embrace what the place offers, it can be super satisfying and rewarding. And not, I don't want people to feel like, I joked a little about it being like hard rock mining, but the plants are so incredible to be able to withstand the conditions. And it's really satisfying to, I have this cat claw acacia that's right outside my window here. And I planted that from a 1 gallon plant like 18 years ago. And I watered it once when I put it in the ground. I planted it in the fall. I watered it once. It's now like 25 feet high. It's got these phainopeplas all over in it. It's a great bird plant. The phainopepla is like a black cardinal. And it's just like, it's like the lilies of the fields. It's just growing on its own. So.
And, I think that's really important, Scott, is a lot of people who have not experienced the Sonoran Desert, they do not realize the diversity of life in that ecosystem and how much you can then bring into your own landscape using these native plants, and then all of the amazing birds and insects that will come to that garden. People just they think the desert is just bereft of any life, but in fact, it's incredibly vibrant and amazingly diverse. Every time I'm there, it's like being in a wonderland. So you've been able to share your expertise and the development of the designs with over 600 people. I mean, it's just incredible. So thank you for sharing your expertise. And it's always a pleasure to see you, whether it's virtually or in person, and to learn from all your fount of hands in the dirt, real life experience. So thanks so much, Scott.
Thank you, Neil.
So Scott's Tucson design, plant list, designer notes, and a list of regional native plant nurseries can be found online at nativegardendesigns.wildones.org. Again, that's nativegardendesigns@wildones.org. Your feedback helps us continually improve our webinars. Actually, that's Native Garden Designs T. Native Garden Design T. Native Garden Tea Designs. Should help us all here on the board. There we go. Well, actually, I've got a typo in here. Native Garden Designs and Wild Ones. So again, your feedback really helps us to continually improve our webinars. This is a great series that's been instituted here recently, and we ask that you please complete a short survey after viewing this program. So Scott, thank you again for joining us, and we hope you feel inspired and empowered to plant more native plants in your community, and have a fabulous day, everyone. Thank you.